All right. Hey there, y'all. Welcome to the clubhouse. This is Lisa Duke, and I'm here in the Money Club today with Josh Overmyer. Josh and I actually met as part of the FIRE community, which is financial independence, retire early. We're both kind of on that path and interested in those topics. We met at a Camp FI. And Josh has an interesting background because he knows about something that I think most people never think about, which is floods and flood insurance. So Josh, can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on how you got where you are and tell us a little bit about floods?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Indiana and went to college for urban planning and development. Graduated from there and immediately moved to Florida because that's where everything was booming back in that 2005, 2006 timeframe. Got a job working in planning zoning in the fastest growing county in the nation, and then the bottom fell out. So of course, everyone's searching for jobs and such, and I actually ended up moving back home with mom and dad for a couple of years and got involved with grant administration for a local firm that basically contracted out for small communities around the state of Indiana to help them with a lot of the stimulus grants that were around in that 2009 to 2011 timeframe. And one of the major grants that we were working on was mitigation grants from some flooding that happened in southern Indiana back in 2008. So that sort of got my interest peaked in the National Flood Insurance Program, community development block grants for disaster recovery, and things along those lines. So when I got a job offer a couple years later for a city planning position with the town of Fort Myers Beach back down here in Southwest Florida, I jumped at it because they also wanted me to be the floodplain coordinator. And so for about 3 years there, I was the National Flood Insurance Program expert for the town of Fort Myers Beach, which also meant I was the community rating system coordinator. And the community rating system is a voluntary program that's part of the National Flood Insurance Program for communities that go above and beyond the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. And for going above and beyond and doing a better job at regulating floodplains, National Flood Insurance Program actually gives premium discounts to homeowners, policyholders in those participating communities.
That's a nice bonus.
Yeah.
So, and you've got a new, I was going to call it a job, but I guess it probably doesn't come with a big paycheck. So maybe a
New
title, a new role coming up. So tell folks a little bit about that.
Sure. So for the last 4 years, I've been a part of the board of directors of the Florida Floodplain Managers Association. That's sort of our professional organization in the state of Florida for people who do this planning, engineering, stormwater management type work. And as of June 1st this year, I will become the chair of the association. So should be 2 years as the chair of the Florida Floodplain Managers Association, culminating at the end of May in 2022. We will be hosting the Association of State Floodplain Managers annual conference in Orlando. So that'll be kind of a really cool way to kind of have a blowout ending to my time as chair of FFMA.
Everybody will come to your retirement party. At least retirement from the floodplain job, right? The national or the Florida organization.
Correct.
So people may be wondering, like, floodplains insurance sounds a little depressing, maybe a little boring. Why should I care? So tell everybody that, I don't know if you remember telling me this story, but as most of my viewers know, I'm recently relocated to Florida. And what were you told? This was by somebody with FEMA, correct?
I'm not sure what
you're not sure which story this is. You're like, I have no idea, Lisa. You tell me. About that everybody in Florida.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So they're the former deputy administrator of the National Flood Insurance Program was speaking at a conference in Miami a couple years ago, and he asked everyone in the audience to pull out their driver's license. Everyone's kind of like, what's going on? Okay, whatever, I'll follow along. What state does that driver's license say? And of course, at a conference in Miami, you've got folks from all over the country, but a lot of Florida focused people. And he says, if it says Florida, you're in a floodplain. And now that's not technically accurate. It's also true that anywhere it rains, it can flood. And so even in the arid Southwest, in the desert, they flood. In Alaska, they flood. In Puerto Rico, they flood. In Vermont, they flood. There are There are floods in Michigan as we speak. There, it was a recent dam that broke.
Yeah, yeah. So
Anywhere it
like
rains, it could flood.
maybe if you're like on top of a hill in a horse farm in Ocala, you might be okay. But for the most part, if you're in Florida, the whole state is a low-lying area. We're surrounded by water on three sides. We get a lot of severe weather with rains and hurricanes and all kinds of things. So I think it's wise, again, everybody kind of use your own judgment, but where we moved, it's really interesting when we purchased the house that we're in now. So our house, like our backyard behind our house, is backyard to backyard with sort of our over the fence neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
They are across the street from waterfront property. And we were in flood zone X, which is like the cheapest one and the one where they're like, basically, you're never going to flood, which would make sense if we were on top of a mountain.
Correct. Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit,
Sure.
and I don't know to what degree we want to get into conspiracy theories and all of that, but just kind of talk a little bit about like how much faith should people put into like, oh, well, my neighbor's house is in the flood zone, but I'm not. So even though our neighborhood is completely flat, I will never get flooded. How reliable are those maps and what guarantees come with the flood zones?
Well, the thing we like to say is that Mother Nature doesn't read flood maps. So they could be the best map in the world, but Mother
Mm-hmm.
Nature's not going to follow along and say, "Oh, well, FEMA said the rain's supposed to stop right here," and so, you know, especially if you're adjacent to a property that's in a flood zone, yeah, you probably should carry flood insurance.
Mm-hmm.
If
Mm-hmm.
if you One thing we like to say is if you cross water on the way to work, it could be a stream or could be a mile wide river, as some of us have down here in Florida. If you're crossing water, you're that close to water as part of your daily commute, then you probably should consider it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the accuracy of the maps, there's definitely some issues with that, but FEMA is conducting what they call a coastal study of all areas in Florida, including a lot of times even one county inland from the Gulf and from the Atlantic because of some of the large rivers that I mentioned just a minute ago. Um, we will be getting new flood maps all around the state of Florida, and that's actually a nationwide effort from Texas all the way up the Atlantic coast.
Mm.
So that's part of what they call a risk map. And so fortunately, we are finally getting some updated flood maps, and definitely, with better technology, better mapping abilities, better computer modeling that can be done. There's going to be some better outputs because of the
Mm-hmm.
better inputs and process.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But do the flood maps, I have heard stories that sometimes they get manipulated for political reasons too. And I don't know if that happens in these big national studies or if it might just be like kind of where the barriers get drawn. Do those kind of things happen as well?
I think it's safe to say that politics plays a part. Some some areas of the state, I'll just mention that there's some areas of the state that are currently still using the National Geodetic Vertical Datum of 1929.
Ooh.
If that kind of tells you how old that standard is,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really just a standard for how surveyors are measuring up from sea level.
Mm.
But there's a newer standard that's the North American Vertical Datum of 1988, and really that's sort of been the standard since at least the middle 2000s. And so that tells you, you know, these three counties, Charlotte County, where I'm the floodplain manager, as well as Miami-Dade and Monroe, which is the Florida Keys.
Mm-hmm.
Those three counties are still on that old standard, so that tells you how old our maps still are.
Yeah, yeah. And again, not to get into politics or religion or any of that, but I think, so I grew up in Arkansas. Even the most country person who does not officially believe in global warming will tell you the weather is different than it was when they were a kid. And we don't have to, worry about what the reasons for that are. I think most of us can agree that like, oh yeah, we just talked the other day, Josh and I talked the other day about officially hurricane season does not start until June 1st. However, you said this is what, the fifth year, is that right? That
I
we've
believe
had
it's the fifth year in a row that we've had a named storm. So using that first A-letter name of the calendar year alphabet for a storm before June 1.
Mm-hmm. So it's good to know your risks before you buy a property, once
Absolutely.
you own a property. And I will say when we were in Georgia, we did not have flood insurance on any of the homes we were in. Atlanta area is kind of hilly. We were never in a downhill. I'm trying to think and make sure this is true. We were never in like a downhill area in any of the houses we were in. So we never had any kind of flood insurance. But I know even in Smyrna, which is metro Atlanta, there's no lakes, there's just a little creek. We had neighbors whose backyards got flooded. One of those big rainstorms came through. If the creek gets blocked, if there's debris like sticks and rocks and logs and things, that can cause the water to back up. And we did have in our property, we had a place that was a vacation home that we also used as a vacation rental, like an Airbnb kind of thing. Now that was kind of uphill, but we went ahead and had flood insurance on it, because if you're not officially in the flood zone, I have a friend from Miami and she's like, if you were standing on your house and you looked in any direction, if you could see the water, you should have flood insurance. You should evacuate in a hurricane. That's kind of her standard. If I'm standing on the roof and I can see water, you are at risk. So we had it there even when we were in Flood Zone X. We had it in this house, which again is Flood Zone X. And the great thing about that is it's pretty cheap. It's like $200-300 a year. So to me, to not have it, again, right, if you're on top of a mountain, I went to school on top of a mountain in Tennessee, we probably didn't need it there. But, if you're in an area where there's a lot of water and you can see the water from your property, or at least from on top of your property, I think it's something to consider. And the fact that the flood maps say it's low risk, that's no guarantee. And for $200-300 a year, and I don't, let me just be clear, I don't sell flood insurance. I don't sell any insurance. So this is not like something to benefit me. I just know that it's a choice that we've made twice now on 2 of the properties we've owned, for exactly the reason that, to me, if you can see water from your house, how many times have we seen this in the news where somebody will say, they always find the most redneck person in Texas or wherever.
They want to be on TV. That's
yeah,
why.
Yeah. I want to be on TV. Interview me. I got the accent and everything. But the guy's always like, I don't know. Usually the creek's over there. Now it's over here. It just got real big. I don't know what happened. Like, dude, if you can see the creek, then
my family's lived on this property for 80 years and it's never flooded. Well, you don't know that when great-grandpa was 12 years old that it didn't flood.
Yeah. And even if it didn't, that's no guarantee. It's like the stock market, right? Past results are no guarantee of future performance. It's a good guess, right? Like if there's no water on your property at all and you're on top of a mountain, probably you're okay. But if there's a creek, if there's a lake, if there's a river, then it could happen. And if you are in that area where the floodplains, the old flood maps that are being used say it won't happen, it just means you can get it really, really cheap. So I don't see why not. When you think, and again, everybody's in a different financial situation, everybody's in a different property situation, but when you consider the cost, $200-300 a year versus what could happen and how much damage, if water gets in your house, you're going to be tearing out all the flooring, all the wall board, all the baseboards. Most of your furniture is probably toast, cabinets. Like again, this is not something that I grew up with, so it's not really in my, but again, I've seen pictures. I have friends out in Houston whose houses were affected when they flooded out there. So it's thousands of dollars in damage. And talk a little bit about like regular homeowners insurance, what that will cover in terms of water. Because I think it does cover if there's like a burst pipe usually, right? But not so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the National Flood Insurance the National Flood Insurance Program basically defines flooding as temporary inundation of water affecting 2 or more properties. And even the street counts as a different property because technically that's like a public right of way. Well, if you get a burst pipe in your house, it's not really affecting 2 properties. And that's not really a temporary inundation. That's a busted pipe. And so if you've got a rainfall event, a high tide event, something like that floods out normally dry land, then that meets the definition of flood. And so homeowners insurance policies 99.9% of the time do not cover floods, the sort of the natural disaster, act of God type of flooding situation. And so that's why we recommend that people buy flood insurance. Even if you're in that X zone that Lisa mentioned earlier, that's the low risk zone. High risk zones are like VE, AE, AH, AO. Those are some of the letter designations for the high risk flood zones. The moderate risk, sort of in between the X and those AE and VE zones are X shaded. So there's still an X zone for regulations purposes, but the shading means that it's actually in the 500-year flood zone. So the reason we regulate those areas is we want to keep our critical facilities such as hospitals, fire stations,
Mm.
community recreation facilities, things like that might need to be used as a shelter. We want to keep those even safer than your typical, single family homes and businesses.
Okay, so now you're really worrying me because one of the things I noticed when we moved to Stewart's really interesting because the river kind of wraps around. So we're actually on so Florida's a peninsula and then Stewart's a little up facing peninsula. And all the fancy houses, of course, are on the waterfront on both sides. And then all the government buildings, like the schools, the churches, the YMCA, everything is like right down the middle. And I guess that's probably why, because if they need to use those places as an emergency shelter, they're not on high ground because there's no high ground. There's high ground in Jensen Beach. They've got like one big hill, but there's no high ground that I've seen in Stewart, but it is at least more central. So yeah, great.
Yeah.
It's not where I'm
Well, and
living right
cities and
now,
towns
but
typically work with their counties and even adjacent counties to work for finding appropriate shelter space. It's an ongoing thing that emergency management throughout the state of Florida deals with on continuing basis, because Florida is a growing state. We have an aging population. We just continue to need more and more shelter space.
Makes sense. I'll tell you another thing while we're on the topic of water. This just popped in my head. I want to be sure to share it. Another example of you might not think that this will affect you and you might think that you are covered by your homeowner's insurance. I have friends in Metro Atlanta whose basement flooded, and I don't quite understand how this all worked, but they traced it back, and the cause was that the downspouts were actually clogged. And so somehow that caused the water to like go into their house instead of out, I guess, away from the foundation through the downspouts. And the homeowner's insurance refused to cover it. And I don't quite remember if it was because, I think it was a combination of it was considered a flood, and then also because they had not maintained their downspouts. It was kind of like negligence, like you didn't do the required maintenance. If you had, this wouldn't have happened. Yeah. So, and I'm not perfect at like gutter cleaning. I just realized I have no idea what the gutters look like on this house. Probably need to look at that as we go into hurricane season. But it just really goes into, the insurance companies are always looking for ways to not pay the claims. So you need to make sure that you do everything you can in terms of having appropriate, maybe even excessive coverage if it's affordable, and also make sure that you're doing all that maintenance, because it ruined so much of their basement. They had to redo all the flooring and the walls up to a certain point. And so water is no joke. Water can do a lot of damage.
Yeah, and I like to say that I think people think of flooding and it's just water. We drink water every day. We swim in water.
Seems harmless. Yeah.
Either lakes or rivers or ponds or pools. But when it's inside your house, it's not water. It's flood crud. It's gas and oil. It's grass clippings, trees, you name it. It's dirt off the road.
Alligator.
It could be an alligator in Florida. Absolutely. And I don't think anybody wants flood crud. It's just gunky, oily, greasy mess in their house. Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. So I do want to keep this fairly short because I know everybody is busy. Is there anything else while we're on the topic of flood? I think we've kind of made the point of if you can see the water and you're not on a big hill, you might want to look at flood insurance, especially if it's really cheap. Is there anything else with regards to flood insurance that you find people don't know or that you want to be sure to mention?
Yeah, I wanted to mention a couple of different things. One thing my boss used to say was, you don't cancel your life insurance because you haven't used it. And a lot of people cancel their flood insurance after a few years because they haven't used it, and it probably won't flood. But you're actually twice as likely to experience a flood over the course of a 30-year mortgage than you are to experience a fire.
Wow.
But we're not dropping our homeowner's insurance because what if a fire happens?
So
what if we get broken in?
Back up and say that again. You're twice as likely to have your house flood as you are to have it burned down in a fire?
Correct.
Wow. And yet we all of us that have a mortgage have homeowners insurance because if for no other reason the bank requires it to protect their investment. But flood insurance, we're just like, yeah, it'll be fine. Not a problem.
Yep.
Wow. Sorry, I totally interrupted you, but I thought
No,
that was really
absolutely.
important.
That's why I made sure I bring it up.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I want to mention is the coverage limits for at least for the national flood insurance policies, national flood insurance program policies, which over 90% of the flood policies in the nation are actually underwritten by the National Flood Insurance Program. Even if you're not buying them direct from the NFIP, you are buying them through State Farm, Allstate, whomever. There's like 64 companies that do what they call write your own. So they're writing a State Farm policy, but it's backed by the National Flood Insurance Program. And so the coverage limits for single family, your typical residential 1 to 4 dwelling units is $250,000 in building coverage and up to
Okay.
$100,000 in contents
Hmm.
coverage. So you don't want to just protect your home, the 4 walls and a roof, but you've got belongings, that could be damaged by flood. And anything that sits on the floor, as Lisa mentioned, that first inch of water can do thousands and thousands of dollars
Mm.
in damage, because anything that's on the floor, the water's going to be wicking up. It's going to
Mm.
be ruining cabinets and all of your kitchen appliances, things like
Mm.
that, because those are electrical, and water and electricity don't mix. When it comes to non-residential, so any kind of like institutional, um, commercial buildings, things like that, the coverage limits are higher. They're $500,000 for the building and $500,000 for contents. So you can kind of think of like a manufacturing facility. They've got a bigger, more expensive building, and then they've got bigger, more expensive equipment inside. That's what those coverage limits are about. And then the private companies have come around in recent years. They have been offering for quite a while what they call surplus lines,
Hmm.
so additional coverage up and above the National Flood Insurance Program limits. But some of them also, the last few years, have been offering private flood insurance policies. So it
Hmm.
definitely does pay to shop around. You may be able to find cheaper rates than the National Flood Insurance Program, but the National Flood Insurance Program since 1968 has really been the only dog in the arena. There's been no other major flood insurance program or flood insurance available, because it really up through the 60s it wasn't a profitable business for insurance companies. So they all dropped out. The National Flood Insurance Program was born, and they really carried the risk all the way up until we got through Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, where now suddenly the National Flood Insurance Program, which had been solvent for all those years, had to go to the Treasury for billions of dollars to pay claims.
Mm.
And so that sort of encouraged insurance companies to go out and cherry pick different policies and try to buy out some of the profitable ones, manage their risk and provide flood insurance coverage, rather than just have everyone insured through the one big pot of money.
Hmm.
So
So
um,
you're saying we have socialized flood insurance?
basically, yeah, and the private market is coming in and trying to grab a piece of that
Hmm.
pie, and the
Hmm.
National Flood Insurance Program welcomes that.
Yeah.
We're more concerned about, I'm kind of speaking on behalf of FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program, we're more concerned about people having coverage than who they buy it from.
That makes sense. Yeah, so it's a really important topic, especially again being new to Florida here coming into hurricane season. It's been raining like crazy the last couple of days here. So I appreciate you going through it, bringing it to everybody's attention. So I know you're not like a flood insurance blogger, but you said you do have a post about this on your blog, correct?
Yeah, so I wrote a blog post called "A Primer on Flood Insurance," basically just kind of covering some of the things I covered here. If you want to, go to joshovermeyer.com/a primer on flood insurance, and Lisa will have the link in the description below. Um, Take a look at that and find out more details.
Fantastic. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you to talk about some of your other adventures that they'll read about on the blog, Josh has a lot more stories. He's got like the worst ever condo purchase story on the face of the planet. He's done all kinds of like side hustles, Ubering. He was just telling me a story about making $3,000 as an Uber driver over what period of time was it?
It was about 6 weeks. Right after I bought my most recent vehicle, I pushed really hard to pay the thing off quickly, and so I made about $3,000 in about 6 weeks during our off season here in Florida, which is really tough.
Mm.
Um, so I could get rid of the loan quickly.
Gotcha. So if people wanted to get in touch with you about any of those other things, is the blog the best place, or is there any place else you would recommend people connect with you?
Sure. So my blog is joshovermeyer.com.
Mhm.
You can email me at josh.overmeyer@gmail.com or find me on Twitter at jovermeyer1.
All right. And he's a lot of fun. He's part of what's called FinTwit. So he knows all the cool kids of all of the personal finance blogging scene and supports specifically a lot of the female bloggers, not exclusively, obviously, but I know you've done a lot. Actually, just as we're wrapping up, tell everybody about the scholarship program that you were involved in. That might be of interest to some of our viewers.
Scholarship
Did I
for
throw you
the
under the bus again?
no scholarship. Well, I was going to say the scholarship for the Invested Development Scholarship.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine, Amanda Holden, has a background Wall Street investing. She think was in a big investment firm in San Francisco area, I believe, but she got tired of basically working to make wealthy old white guys richer, and so she's taken that knowledge and trying to get it out to the masses. Folks like myself and younger millennials trying to get a step ahead. And so I didn't necessarily need her basics of investing course, but I wanted to support her and I wanted
Mhm.
to help someone else gain the knowledge that Amanda was teaching. So I sponsored two seats in her invested development class last March or April, I believe. And by putting the word out on Twitter, I think we had 9 scholarship seats paid for by other personal finance bloggers and such. And that has continued. I think she's had a couple dozen now seats
That's wonderful.
paid for.
So, well, thank you so much for joining me today. Josh Overmyer, blogger, Uber, all around hustler.
And chair of the Florida Floodplain Managers Association.
Yay! Congratulations. So,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for joining me and definitely appreciate your time. And for all of my viewers, come back and check out the other videos on the site. We're going to be talking a lot more about finance topics and people's money stories. So, stay tuned for all of that, and we'll see you around.